couple of things. I could say just a few words to set up as to why I thought it'd be wonderful to have this conversation. I mean, my own background is in art. But I have been working with architects and designers for many years, and I have been sort of like following your work for also for years now. And what I think, just to lay it out there, what I find so exciting about it, and what I think that I started teaching it, and I started just thinking as a of the let's say of like diverse intelligence, as I think you pointed out already, as a broader field of research. And sort of my interest in like the questions I ask is how can we as artists and as designers and architects sort of participate in the field and ask questions that we all can share to a certain extent. And I think the regeneration as a paradigm, or it has, for me, I would almost say it has become a paradigm. If we're moving from, let's say, extraction to regeneration, and that for me also touches upon what you called mind blindness and many other things. And one thing that I found so really striking in one of your last conversations with, I think her name's Pam Leon or Leon. Yeah. She, I think towards the end, she said something along the lines of, if your work was recognized on a, let's say, even broader scale, the implications of it, we wouldn't have, or I think we would be better equipped to handle, let's say, the ecological crisis that we're facing among several other crises. And I think that is something I would use as a starting point or as a point of connection to see how creative practices can actually sort of align with this field of inquiry. That was my, let's say, starting point. I'm super, by the way, I really, it's wonderful that Anna, you were able to join in here. I think your perspective on this is super valuable. And that is, let's say, where I'm coming from as a creative practitioner.
Well, I'm also coming from the creative world. I'm coming from the field of architecture, and of course, all those questions that you asked, right, in your introduction, are very relevant and discussed in our field quite a lot. Do we all know how to apply this knowledge that Michael is working on? Of course not, but it's an interesting conversation to have, and I hope that we will continue to have and see what we as practitioners that create spaces, create buildings, can learn from biology and or processes that exist in biology and apply them in our field.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the first thing I want to say is that Pamela is very kind, and I just want to be clear that I am making no claims to knowing how to turn my ideas into resolving something as big as the ecological crisis, right? So I make no claims about that, but I do think that there's something very deep that unites the kinds of things that we're all interested in here, which is, and it's a weird way of putting it, certainly for biologists, but maybe you will recognize it more from your side. I think one important thing that ties all this together is the importance of storytelling, and specifically this idea of continually, which is what I think living things do all the way from the bottom. So from the molecular networks to the cells to the tissues that make up your body, all of these systems, and of course the organisms themselves and probably ecosystems too, I guess, what they're constantly doing is dynamically creating and revising a model of themselves in the outside world, right? We have this idea that the memories that you're given, so the genetics that your past lineages have passed on to you, there's this kind of standard view where these things are prescriptive of here's your genome and this is what you're going to be and this is what you're going to do and so on. But that's actually not how it works. And if you want, we can get into some of that. Rather, what these things are prompts from your past self, like our memories are, or from past versions of your lineage, and they have to be creatively interpreted at all times to make them not the most not the most similar story to what was happening before, but to the most adaptive, useful story of what you're going to do next. And this process is, I assume you guys can tell me. I assume this is something relevant to what artists do in terms of interpreting the things that they've been given in terms of past performance of other people in the past and the natural world around them, is to use these things to tell better and more interesting and more adaptive stories into the future. And my point is that all of life does this, from evolution to embryonic development to regeneration to all of these kinds of events are basically an ongoing process of sense making.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's a wonderful point. There would be a lot to say from my perspective on art, and perhaps we can get there. What I would, let's say, one thing, this again, for me, as you were saying, for me, art practice is fundamentally regenerative, and I can maybe expand on that. But I suppose the question I find so interesting is because regeneration and care and repair, they are ubiquitous at this point in the design, art, and architecture discourse. And yet I find, I suppose, the implications of diverse intelligence, meaning how do we actually step beyond what you call mind blindness? How can we design for let's say forms of cognition that go just vastly beyond the human, and as you were saying, also like diverse embodiments? How do we, to a certain extent, integrate diverse embodiments in the way that we structure worlds, so to speak? I find this question, for me, it's of paramount importance to design practices. Anna, do you have any thoughts on this, on the, let's say, this discourse in regeneration, because it's everywhere and it should be, and yet I find it to a certain extent sometimes limited in terms of what it intends to integrate.
Sorry, I think that was a question for Anna, or no?
Yeah, maybe Anna, if I'd love to hear just a couple of thoughts on, if you're interested, on this question of like, do you see limitations to the extent that I just laid them out, or how do you, maybe in your own practice or in your observation of the discourse, where would you locate it?
Sure. Well, the idea of mind blindness is, I guess, coming from the point where we are unable to perceive intelligence in forms that don't look like us, right? So we are surrounded by all other forms. We're surrounded by plants, fungi, bioforms, but the design inherently was always human-centered, and we were always designing habitats for the rational, upright, kind of tool-using beings, right? But at the same time, we now understand that we are if we start to expand this cognitive map, we need to, well, not need to, but we need to think about how we can include other forms of intelligence. And so in this sense, I think that there are some interesting projects that are being done in the past, recent past, that where design starts to question that and kind of address it through different means. One of the projects that was done by Baruch Happold, it's called Cookfox, where they design a facade that at the same time as being a protective element for the building, as an enclosure, but also works as the habitat for the other species, small birds, insects, and plants as well. So this is the way how design so far interprets this notion of inclusion of other forms. We also, there was another project, because when we talk about this, we need to think about how we can not only design for those other forms of intelligence, but also how we can design with them. And another project that comes to mind is that it's a pavilion that was designed for the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program that was built from the biological bricks that were grown instead of built. And those bricks are, they made of the mycelium, it's the roots of the fungi, and they were grown. So there was no technology applied in the process. But, this is definitely a huge paradigm shift, because now we are moving from the human-centered to the multi-intelligent centered design.
Yeah, another interesting way to look at this is that in terms of this idea that of freedom of embodiment, right? So one of the things that we're working on, of course, is regenerative therapeutics to fix birth defects and reprogram cancer and to regrow missing or damaged structures and things like that. But it's pretty clear that once you have the answer to those questions, and the question is basically, how do I communicate the correct final shape to a set of cells, right? That's really the bottom line to all of these biomedical needs, is the ability to communicate a final form to groups of cells that they will then build. Once you have that information, you don't have to stick to the original design of current modern humans. You can modify that in many ways, and of course, there is nothing particularly unique or special about today's human anatomy. There are many things that we would want to fix and improve and change, and just in general, this idea of freedom of embodiment. I think in the future, people will look back and the way that we look back on some of our early hominid ancestors and the way they lived, and they would say, wow, it is amazing that these people were just born in whatever random body nature gave them, and they had to stay that way their whole life. They had no choice about it. I mean, I think people are going to be really kind of find that wild. So anyway, so the point is that, much like what I said about a month ago to a convention of psychoanalysts, which is that your clientele is about to get a lot weirder and wider than normal humans, and you're going to have to figure out how to deal with beings that are cyborgs and hybrids and extended and altered in many different ways. And it's very interesting. And I know nothing about architecture or design, but it's very interesting to me to think about how we're going to design those things when the beings for whom we are designing acquire an incredible variety of form and cognition, right? So you can just imagine you're going to have, you've got your standard humans, let's say, and then you're going to have beings that have senses that are about the solar weather and the stock market and the emotional state of their best friend and whatever. Like, these will be primary senses that we have, right? The work of David Eagleman and lots of people in the sensory augmentation and sensory substitution space. And you'll have people with additional limbs and additional different ways of manipulating their environment, and who knows what kind of chairs they're going to need once their basic body plan is quite different. I don't know. I'd love to hear you guys talk about that, because I don't think it's that far off, actually, and I wonder what the world is going to look like when you can't assume that the beings for whom you're building have the same standard structure that we've had for millions of years.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at also, and trying to sort of make progress in my own thinking and practice. Because, as I said, I despite the discourse being very present, as it should be, I wonder if we're grasping the full implications, because I think, as you pointed out as well, when we think about AI and the AI embodiment and we sort of revert back to something sort of human, a robot, some kind of things that walks around. And as you pointed out, we can think of embodiment in terms of in ways that we in ways that sort of vastly transcends that. And are we prepared, sort of, or can we actually at least come closer to finding ways of integrating that? And also, when it comes to, let's say, also specifically, I think I would say in its own right, and less so from a perspective that is yet again um, more or less, let's say, um, yeah, I would say integrate, or yeah, and I think that's important on what you said. We're of course designing with, and I said designing for, and I think that's an important distinction here. It's a sort of collaboration as it should be, and but I think we're sort of coming. That there's a danger for me that I want to sort of find ways of navigating, that we're easily sort of appropriating other forms of cognition to the extent that we don't recognize what they're actually doing. And I think that question is very interesting and very hard to navigate. And I think where Mike, your work comes in and is so powerful, to this discourse.
Yeah, well,
Well, yeah.
where I think we're going to have to end up is like right now, what we see in biology is that the environment is what it is, and that various beings are really good at adapting themselves, not just on an evolutionary timescale, but on a single individual being's timescale, adapt themselves to the reality of the environment. We have all kinds of examples of plasticity in our lab, where you make changes, in fact, sometimes pretty drastic changes, and life finds a way to be a coherent organism that will persist despite all these changes that you're making. So I would love to see a future in which the environment, through the efforts of your community, what we have is an environment that actually adapts to the being as well. So, right, so there's agency on both sides, so that if it's not a one size fits all, where beings with different cognitive structures have to adapt to an environment that's comfortable for one kind of being, but maybe not at all comfortable for some other kind of being, right? Both physically and mentally. But could we? I mean, can you think, is this too crazy, or can you think of a future in which your environment, meaning that the space that you live in, the space that you work in, the space that we navigate outside and so on, has elements that actively seek a kind of harmonious collaboration with all kinds of weird beings that are going to be living there, so that it's not just a one directional, okay, now we have to have the plasticity to adjust to whatever the world looks like, but actually we are now building artifacts, both indoors and outdoors, that are actually meeting you halfway and trying to have a more harmonious interaction with whatever your cognition happens to be.
Mm. If I can add to this, I'm looking at it, of course, from the position of the space and how we inhabit the space. And I want to say it again that historically we were approaching it from the understanding that we all look the same and we somewhat behave similarly, and therefore the spaces that we design should be designed for the average human being, and again, being human-centered. But as we look forward, I think it would be very interesting to look at the ability of the space to adapt to very unusual beings, as Michael was saying. And the way to start with it is very interesting, but there were some ideas done and interpreted at the very small scale when we were talking about the wearable architecture, where we create a very small environment but incredibly adaptable for the particular person who inhabits this environment. So we mentioned the idea of the compression in the bow tie architecture, for example, when you can use the small module as a way to experiment with this kind of a individual as an individual habitat, and then maybe multiplied. So maybe the future is in this the modules that will be multiplied, but every single module will never look the same as the one next to it.
I find that, yeah, I find that super interesting. Of course, this model of, let's say, compression expansion, in that I suppose this notion of creative creative interpretation or reinterpretation, and to do so, let's say, together or communally. That's where I would see, at least speaking from an artistic practice, exactly, I think, where art sort of can potentially intervene and sort of find ways, or produce a framework, or some sort of conditions where there is let's say, let's call it a coming together in a way. So I think of regeneration in a sense as like a kind of creative coming together, and sort of expanding from there. And to do so anew, we have to continuously, I think, renegotiate that. And that's what really interests me, how to intervene in that regard, and to do so alongside, uh, again, different forms of intelligence, and also to see them. This is the other point that really interests me, to see them not only as, yeah, as agential, but as creative, and as expressing in their own right, meaning, um, meaning let me see if I well, that's, I think, well, this is a profound quote. I'm not sure. This is a box we could maybe open up a little bit here, Mike, when because you quoted Jung in the Ingressing Minds paper, when you said the artist is one who allows art to realize its purposes through him or her. And I suppose, actually, we might as well think of artist here as a designer or an architect. And that's a controversial quote. I think it's enormously interesting. Is there? I could sort of guess your intentions of including it, but maybe you could say, Mike, what made you respond to it in that way?
Yeah, I interpret it in an even more controversial way than one might think, which is to, by artist, I mean cells and tissues and even
Mm,
molecular networks,
mm,
because all of these things are in continuous process of navigating various problem spaces. And for reasons we can get into, a lot of that, a lot of what they're doing is not algorithmic; it's creative. And this idea
exactly.
that what they're actually doing is, which I assume artists as scientists and inventors and whatnot are also doing, is navigating the space of possible solutions to some problem. The problem might be, how do I survive the next 10 minutes, or what is the meaning of life going forward, and anywhere in between. And this continuous search for solutions in a problem space where there are many things that you could do is something that is faced by particles as they go through what are called least action laws to find the most efficient path to wherever they're going. And then you start building up, and the things that we call life, which are these networks that navigate different kinds of problem spaces. All have to do this. They all have to search through a space of enormous possibilities. They don't have time to really kind of do an exhaustive search, because they will be dead long before that happens. So now, what is the process by which everything from molecular networks for cells up to human artists and various geniuses who just sort of find solution, they're in the flow and they find solutions easy, and the rest of us that are kind of methodically cranking through some process to get there. What are the processes by which all of these beings identify the thing that they're looking for? And one of the directions that we're going into now is actually looking at it from a slightly different perspective, to say that the agency is not just on the side of the being who has to sift through an enormous amount of passive data and passive material, that actually there are patterns, and in that Platonic space paper, I argue that some of these patterns are familiar, low agency things like facts of mathematics and so on, but some of them are very complex, high agency things like kinds of minds and everything in between, that these patterns are actually active in that process, and that it's not that we are ourselves just looking through a bunch of passive patterns. The patterns themselves have a kind of we don't really have the vocabulary for it. I don't know if you want to call it a force or a drive or something, but they are actively reaching out to the solution, is in some sense reaching out to this to an appropriate seeker, right? And again, I don't just mean the human inventor trying to create a majestic work of art. This is for everything. This is all the way down, okay, all the way down through the material of life. And so that's the idea, that there are these they look like, to the biologist, they look kind of like free lunches, in the sense that you make something, or you engineer something, or evolution evolves a certain embodiment, and it immediately becomes the recipient and the beneficiary of all kinds of amazing facts of mathematics that do not come from the physical world. Right? These are things that are not determined by any facts or truths about the physical world. They're facts of mathematics that come from a different world, but they provide all sorts of amazing advantages for free. That's why they're called free lunch. Just as a simple dumb example, in case this doesn't make any sense. Imagine that in your world, the highest fitness belongs to a particular kind of triangle. Okay, so you're in some world where there's a certain kind of triangle that is the organism with the highest fitness. So evolution will crank through a bunch of generations finding the first angle, and then it'll crank through a bunch more generations finding the second angle. And then it doesn't need to look for the third angle, because in flat space, if you have two angles, what the third one is. You don't have to find it. Now, where does that fact come from? You didn't have to evolve it. Evolution just saved itself 1/3 of the search time to finish this construction. And it's this magical gift from the laws of geometry that you don't actually have to do any effort to get. You just have to make the conditions right, and then here you are. That's the ingression, right? The ingression is when you build a physical interface, and you pull down a bunch of these amazing truths of mathematics that then evolution makes use of. So that's what I was going for there. I thought that quote kind of summarized really well this idea that much as we are searching for solutions to our problems and to various works of creative works and so on, I think in an important sense these things exist separately, and I think they are in effect searching for us in a very symmetric way to the way that we are searching for them. So that's what I thought. That's what that quote said to me.
Mm. That's of course a wonderful. I've read the paper, of course, and I think it's a wonderful and really intriguing notion. Let's see, the idea. I mean, let's say, Anna, could I ask you, the idea that we locate purpose, so to speak, outside of the traditional author, how would you react? How would you react to that? Is that something we can work with?
Yes, no, I think that I guess and everything that relates to a creative endeavor, we can examine from that point of view where the ideas are coming from, and how are they generated. I am of course what Michael was talking about, it's a very interesting perspective, and I'm honestly, I don't have all of the answers to how we can put our thinking in the creative field, address some of these interesting points that Michael was making. I'm interested personally in the idea of the physical interface, and I was wondering if we see the architecture or art as this kind of a physical interface, would that be possible for us to understand better of where the ideas are coming from and how they become a physical reality, and that's what I guess I'm thinking about.
Mm. The interface, that is, I mean, the idea that Mike, as you were saying, the idea that there is a um a drive or sort of an affect for these for this for lack of a better term, for this, let's say, force or something to be physically instantiated. Yeah, that's of course, I understand you obviously have been talking a lot about Bergson and Whitehead, and I'm not a philosopher, but I try to engage with these theories to an extent, sort of to try to make sense of this. And yes, the interface, it's a very nice concept to think about, this, or the physical interface, as you were just saying. Um, I suppose the for I mean for me, I suppose we the I mean this code is quite sort of, it's quite a little bit destabilizing for someone who's, let's say, coming out of a sort of a Western artistic discourse, and you have an author and you have an artist. One thing that for me, Mike, and I was going to mention this as well, um, since your notion of basal cognition, and is in a sense the idea that actually like a trace of cognition can be found everywhere, if I understand you correctly. Um, I believe actually that I would say this is true for art as well. That maybe in a sense, almost like art and cognition may intersect to a certain extent. I think that actually everything we could say, I'm not sort of prepared to take the argument to its full, let's say, development here, but I suppose that everything might express art to a certain extent. For that, however, we have to give up the thinking that this is art and this is not art, and this is again something you're saying, this is the conscious, this is not conscious, and so on and so forth. Which we do, right? We have to say this is art, this is not art, especially actually in a more contemporary discourse where art is sort of like contextually based, and sort of you bring something into a context, it turns into art, you take it out, it ceases to be art, it's just an object or something, right? Um, this is also an important discourse, but for me, it's a lot more interesting and actually a lot more, let's say, complicated and also like disconcerting in a certain extent to think that, yeah, everything might express art to a certain extent, even regardless of how small it might be. And that's actually a way of thinking. I'm not sure. Could we say, I would be prepared just intuitively to actually say that design architecture, actually architecture as an organizing principle, um, same rule might apply, but of course that's beyond my competency. But I think this is to me a really interesting way of thinking right now. And again, Mike, you have sort of inspired that to a certain extent. Mm. Especially this notion of, we have to think in gradients and not in this like 0, 0, 1 paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm hardly gonna. I'm certainly not going to try to define art or anything like that. But I agree with you that if we focus on the aspect that is creative interpretation, that basically this is a system actually that Josh Bongard and I have been developing called polycomputing, and it's this idea that I'm sure you guys will recognize, which is that unlike in other areas of computer science and other sciences where you have something and it has one objective meaning, and we can sort of argue about what that is, but eventually we get to the right answer, and that's it. Like, we all know now what this means. Polycomputing is this idea that actually you have to focus on the extraction and the creation of meaning by various observers. That it's basically that the outcome of any computation and that any physical process, and the question of what does this thing actually compute, that there is no one correct answer, that it's basically in the eye of the beholder. And I've certainly heard this idea in, let's say, literature and things like that. Once what the person who wrote it may or may not have had something in mind, but that's not necessarily what it means, and other readers are free to sort of get something else out of it, right? That idea. So from that perspective, that every physical system is doing something that can be interpreted by itself and by others around it, other observers. And when I say observers, I don't just mean human scientists. I mean parasites, conspecifics, its own parts, the system of which it is a part. So all observers, all up and down scales in biology, all of those are up for grabs and up for interpretation in the most adaptive, useful, creative way that they can. Right, and this is what we see with genomic information. This is what we see with memories, the behavioral memories, and other kinds of information. That what living systems, or the things that we call living, are especially good at is this kind of creative interpretation of what's going on, to find a perspective from which this thing is the most interesting and useful about how to live life into the future. And again, you see it as an extremely practical thing for very simple organisms, and then kind of a very, very broad, large scale, lifelong endeavor for humans and beyond. So yes, I agree with you. I think that in a certain sense, what's special about art is happening everywhere, all the way down. And just one other quick thing. I mean, you said something very interesting earlier, about coming together, and how it is that subunits come together. And I just want to point out that ability to interpret things is critical for coming together in specific ways. And I'm sure you guys have other examples of this. When we look at an early embryo, which might have, I don't know, let's say hundreds of thousands of cells, the reason that we say, oh look, there's one embryo, instead of, hey, here's 100,000 cells, what we're actually counting as one when we look at it is a story that all of those cells have bought into. They're committed to one story about a path they're going to take through anatomical space. That's what makes it an embryo, is because they are all aligned to the same representation of what the correct pattern is going to be, and they're all going to work together really hard to make that pattern. If you try to intervene and disrupt them, they will find new ways around it. They will do all kinds of clever things to get there. But it's a coherent whole instead of a bunch of parts, because of a model of itself that holds them together. So this idea of stories and models that hold parts together into wholes that have their own separate identity, and the ability to project into larger problem spaces and things like that is really critical. And so that question, and this is something, I mean, it sounds very kind of philosophical and airy and whatever, but we use this in the lab every day as a roadmap to therapeutics. This idea that what you're actually manipulating when you want to regrow a limb, or normalize a tumor, or fix a birth defect, what you should be actually manipulating is not the genome, not the molecular pathways, not the cells, which is where modern molecular medicine is focused. But what we can actually manipulate are the stories and the ways in which these cells actually buy into these things. And if you want, I can give you some very specific examples about how we do this. But that's really the driving principle, right? This kind of these cognitive glue mechanisms that bind subunits towards a particular outcome. That's an amazingly important and tractable target if you want the complex system to do something different than it was doing before.
Mike,
Yeah.
super interesting. Yeah, Anna, please.
I think that yes, it is super interesting. I was just thinking that in this sense, we can see, I'm very interested in this notion of polycomputing, and again, I'm going to propose to see the architecture or some forms of art as a kind of a polycomputational interface, if you will, because from the architectural point of view, the building is not as does not have a single function. It's always depend on the observer and the user and how you interpret it. And again, that ties back to what Michael was saying about the interpretation and the ability to translate certain things. The architecture inherently is as a shelter, right? But the shelter means a lot of things for a lot of beings, right? So and it all depends on the context, I guess. And if we look at the work of Derrida, where he says that the our signifier relates on at the how the context is working, and we can start seeing spaces, architecture, not much more than a shelter, and depending on who is inhabiting. And at the same time, architecture we can, for some, it could be seen as the thermal regulator, right? So it's a place where we don't get exposed to the elements, don't get frozen. Also, we talked about that the architecture can be habitat for other species, and I don't know, maybe some kind of a bioelectric field shaper. I don't know what it is.
Mhm.
But the fact is that I think it's interesting to start looking at it not as a just as a one the single functioning element, but the element that can be interpreted from many different angles and for many different species, used for many different species.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Mike, I was just thinking as you were talking just now, the I really like this quote from Richard Watson where he says where he differentiates between what exists persists and what relates creates. And I suppose he, in a sense, puts the emphasis on what relates, creates. Though I think persistence and existence is nonetheless an important perspective. And I think what you were just saying, in a sense, is there is a persistence on the basis of a shared story. If or is and but I think the or actually I think perhaps you could say that the existing and persisting is always intertwined with this continual creative aspect of relating. But I suppose the conditions of the shared story, um, where do you where would you locate that if I just to yeah.
Yeah, well, so two things. First of all, on the persistence
Mm,
aspect, in order to there are always multiple observers, and the system itself persists for itself in specific ways, but different observers may or may not see it. Just as an example, if you have a soliton wave or a hurricane or anything like that, if an observer is able to pull back to an appropriate scale of space and time, they can see a system persisting for some amount of time. If they zoom in and they're hyper focused on the molecules of air or water, they're not going to see any kind of large scale persistent object because the matter keeps moving in and out, right? When you have a wave moving through an excitable medium, it's not the material that moves, right? So if you're focused on a particular piece of water, let's say you see it moving up and down, and that's the end of that. What you don't see is this persistent wave that actually travels across. So it's up to the observer actually, and this goes back to our point about truly diverse intelligence. It's always an IQ test for the observer to say, do you see what's actually persisting here and what level of intelligence it has? Because we may be focused on entirely the wrong thing, and just be completely blind to it. As I mean, I tell this fictional story sometimes to kind of illustrate this idea that imagine these beings that live in the core of the earth, right? And they're incredibly dense, and they've got the gamma rays for eyes for vision and whatnot, and so they come up out of the surface. What do they see? Well, they don't see us, and they don't see any of the physical objects, the tangible stuff around us. We are a thin gas to them, a thin plasma. They're right. They're so dense that all of us are like in the base, basically in this barely detectable phase. And they'll, if they have the tools to the equipment to detect it, they will see patterns in that gas that hold together for about 100 years, and they sort of look like they're kind of doing things, but they're you can easily forgive them for thinking that, well, patterns in a gas can't be agents. We are real physical agents. We're real beings. These are just patterns in a gas. They're cool and all, but they're like waves in the medium. You can't really take them very seriously. And so it's really up to the observer to have the both the physical capabilities and then the mental structure to actually be able to observe these other beings. And just as a specific example of how these stories are implemented, so think about in this case a frog embryo, but it's basically the same in all others. Um, the question of why are your eyes located in where they are? Well, earlier as the head starts to be formed, there's a very particular bioelectrical pattern within the tissue that says build an eye here. And what we've learned to do is A, detect that pattern, and B, to recreate that pattern somewhere else. So what we can do is go in and create, and this is not by applying electric fields or anything like that. We have very much more subtle ways of manipulating the electrical properties of cells, the way that they manipulate each other's electrical properties. And we can set that, we can create that voltage pattern somewhere else, let's say in the tail of the embryo, and say make an eye here. So what happens then is very interesting. We can manipulate a few cells, and what those cells do, they realize immediately that there's not enough of them to build a complete eye. And what they do is they tell their neighbors, hey, you got to help us build an eye. They try to recruit their neighbors. And we can see this because we know exactly which cells we've manipulated, and we know exactly which cells we did not touch. And they also participate in the formation of an ectopic eye. And you get an eye on the tail, on the tail of a tadpole. But what's actually happening is that those cells are telling their neighbors, we are all going to make an eye. So we force them into this story that there should be an eye here. They've bought in. They are going to then convince their neighbors. We don't need to worry about that as engineers because we're dealing with this amazing agential material that has the ability to do that. We didn't have to teach them to do that. They already do that. So we insert this new idea that make an eye here. That's a particular bioelectrical pattern that basically specifies the meaning of what we're trying to say. They try to convert their neighbors, but their neighbors, as part of an ancient cancer suppression mechanism, aren't just sitting there. They resist. So the neighbors are actually saying the opposite. They're saying to these cells, no, you should be skin. And so there's a battle. What's actually happening here is a competition between two worldviews, so to speak. And I'm purposely using these because we're here talking about these larger human kinds of issues. What you're looking at here is the battle of two models of what should our future look like. And so you've got a set of agents that say it should look like this, it should be an eye. You got a bunch of other agents that say, no, you're an aberrant growth, and we're going to try to equalize you out and make you like us, which is skin. And depending on how you do it, sometimes the one wins and sometimes the other wins. And so sometimes you see that the eye just barely starts to get going, and then the other cells, they normalize it, they wipe it out, and you get nothing. And that's when the skin model has won. And other times the eye idea takes hold, and it sort of captures a region, and boom, and you've got this eye on the tail, and and eventually you end up with a frog with an eye on its butt. And these eyes are functional, by the way. So we can actually see, we have the ability to read and then to inject modified versions of these models of themselves and of the future into tissue and watch and of course our control is still very poor, but ultimately when we get really good at this is the roadmap to regenerative medicine, to build, you can tell cells build whatever, and to the extent that we are convincing, meaning that we are able to induce the right amount of plasticity, and so we're working with plastogens and other things to sort of open up the possibility space, because what kind of messages you're willing to hear is very much part of your priors and your history. So some of these cells are the things that give rise to scarring and other things that are non-regenerative in mammals. Let's say they're not particularly natively open to these other signals, but you can make them more so. So that's kind of a roadmap to creating the construction that you want, is by changing the story, not the hardware, but the story that they're going to follow.
Mike, I think this perspective of that you just outlined of agential patterns, that's really transformative. I mean, for me, it was transformative to think about it. That as you say, quoting James, thoughts are thinkers. Thoughts might be thinkers. And actually, what that means. But here, what interests me, and this also touches upon what Anna said earlier about the not a single function, and let's say the openness to interpretation, and so this may be, how do we, again, like for me, like from an art design perspective, how do we think about diversity and sameness at the same time? And I think what someone like Yosha talks about a lot, let's say shared purpose, and maybe shared purpose is something that, Mike, you might have touched upon in what you just said. And how do we create or facilitate or communicate shared purpose in our, let's say, practices. And I think that's, yeah, that is something that where we, I suppose, where we negotiate this dynamic of diversity and commonality, I suppose. And that I think is a really, for me, it's a really profound question of what artistic or design practices could do, or could, let's say, aspire to create the conditions for. And I think there again, I see a kind of a like a little bit of an overlap, as at least like sort of conceptually, Mike, with what you were just saying. Maybe like, let's say, convince cells um, to set to orient according to a set point, rather than drawing from a genomic library or something, which I think they do. But again, here always stepping about boundaries here. But I think you emphasize the let's say the purpose. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I
Or
think
the or, yeah.
well, the big thing here is that you in biology, and I assume it was soon, if not already, in architecture and design, what you're dealing with in an agential material requires a completely different kind of engineering. So for thousands of years, we've engineered with passive matter. And the upside is that it doesn't provide too many surprises. The downside is that basically all it knows how to do is hold its shape. And if you want to make it do something, you're in charge of every aspect of it. If you want to build a simple machine, you're in charge of everything. Once you start working with, then we had active matter and computational matter, and then of course in biology we have these agential materials where the material itself has an agenda, it has learning capacity, it has you can't engineer with it by micromanaging it the way you would with a passive material. You're much more in the land of the behavioral sciences, where what you're actually doing is reward and punishment, convincing, collaboration with the material, right? And I'd love to hear you guys talk about what that might look like on the architecture and design side. But for us, it's very much like you're leaving a lot on the table if you think you're going to. And this is why, by the way, we have barely any drugs that actually fix whatever they're designed to. Besides antibiotics and a couple of other things. They mainly just try to force a molecular state. They don't actually repair, and oftentimes you get side effects and limited efficacy because the material fights back, right? And we're only scratching the surface now of actually learning how to reset the set points and basically get the buy-in of your material to shift to a different state. So I think that requires a completely different way of building. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess the way I see it, that in architecture and design, and especially when we talk about the environments that we create for other beings, for people in particular, we always use this kind of a top-down approach when we know that how things should look like and how they will function, and these are the certain rules, and we're going to follow those rules. But the way we Michael is talking about it, it's very interesting, because we understand now that there are multiple components that do not always follow the specific rules, or even those rules they may not even apply to everything that we do. And I'm actually very interested in the idea that Michael was talking about, that there are some there are some elements that may not, they have their own intelligence. And if we start breaking down the elements that comprise of the space, and recognize that some of them, they may have operate on a very the kind of independent level, but at the same time following the same goal, then we can achieve much more adaptive environments and much more intelligent environments at the end. So again, it's an interesting notion of understanding of how those elements can eventually follow the same goal, but yet from very different angles and perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I have a lot lots of notes made and things to think about, and I also understand, of course, that yeah, we're reaching the end here. I'm super appreciative of your time and of you joining in here. Let's say, I mean, one to touch upon. I mean, of course, this goes way beyond our limit here, but I think, Mike, one thing I think that you touch upon in the paper as well is and of course we're not going to get there at this point, but the I think the what I thought about is the idea that do we when we think about, let's say, this notion of ingression, I suppose could we think about the idea that this manifests differently according to let's say a certain um, physical, cultural, historical conditions of how that ingression is instantiated. I wonder if we, because I think what I try to think about, let's say, could we, which I think is already, let's say, in place, but let's say, regard this less of a universal of an or of an essence, which I don't think you do, but I think the dynamic of ingression, could that actually be dependent upon the condition of its instantiation? But I think this might actually be a little bit too broad a question to end upon. That's also fine.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that again, back to this idea of observer perspective.
Mm,
So I think the ingression does what it does, but it's up to us as observers to recognize it and to notice it and to use it as a creative prompt or an affordance for our activities and so on. Yeah.
mm.
But anyway, thank you so much for having this discussion and for letting me think about these wild things that are like usually just completely outside my my standard remit. So thank you for that.